So this book by Carol Gilligan, it's got 6 chapters. We read the first 3, the first of which we've talked a little bit about women's place in man's life cycle. It's sort of a review of literature, talks about Freud, about Piaget, about Lawrence Kohlberg, in particular, this psychologist who Gilligan even did some work with, who had posited this framework for judging moral development. And according to Kohlberg and according to Freud and according to these other theorists she talks about, women were always just judged to be deficient on this, that they didn't achieve a full moral sensibilities, which involve this grasp of abstract justice and things. So it's kind of, if you're looking at it from the point of view of Kant, that you're going from, as a child, this selfishness to wanting to just fit in, to actually internalizing, to, in Freudian terms, getting the superego in there, into an abstract appreciation for doing the right thing and justice. And Kohlberg's scale seemed to have been built on observations of men, and so Gilligan thinks that's a problem. So the point of this book is, what if we look at women in this respect? Can we get some different results? And so chapters 2 and 3 are, 2 is mostly about asking college students about some particular moral dilemmas and what sort of verdicts they yield and how they describe the situation and how they interpret, just how they do moral reasoning in general. And then chapter 3 was this discussion that Dylan alluded to, where this is just a group of women that are having pre-abortion counseling. Is that right? So this is not meant to be a representative sample of the population at all. She's very upfront about that. But it's just asking, what goes into making their decision, and can we draw any conclusions based on that about what constitutes healthy moral development in women as opposed to some sort of deficiency?
That's a fine overview. I read a version that came out in 1992, which included a long preface by Gilligan, which was pretty interesting in itself. And she has, as a kind of overview statement from her, at the beginning of that preface, I'll just read this paragraph. She says, "In listening to people's responses to In a Different Voice, I often hear the 2-step process which I went through over and over again in the course of my writing. The process of listening to women and hearing something new, a different way of speaking, and then hearing how quickly this difference gets assimilated into old categories of thinking so that it loses its novelty and its message. Is it nature or nurture? Are women better than men, or worse? When I hear my work being cast in terms of whether women and men are really essentially different, or who is better than whom, I know that I have lost my voice, because these are not my questions. Instead, my questions are about our perceptions of reality and truth, how we know, how we hear, how we see, how we speak. My questions are about voice and relationship, and my questions are about psychological processes and theory, particularly theories in which men's experience stands for all human experience, theories which eclipse the lives of women and shut out women's voices. I saw that by maintaining these ways of seeing and speaking about human lives, men are leaving out women, but women were leaving out themselves. In terms of psychological processes, what for men was a process of separation, for women was a process of dissociation that required the creation of an inner division or psychic split. That dissociation is part of what she really tries to get to in those interviews, is the idea that there are different voices that each person has, and that one thing that happens with women, besides having maybe in general women having a kind of different voice than men in general, for a number of reasons, that voice, regardless, gets suppressed. And maybe the word exploited would come in there. Gilligan doesn't use that word, as I recall. So I guess for me, what I was interested in reading the Gilligan was the idea of the different psychological processes that men and women go through and what that difference meant.
Should we give the Heinz example from chapter 2 here, which seems to take up a large portion of the discussion? Sure. So men and women are given this example to analyze, which is a guy's wife is dying of some disease. This pharmacist has the medicine, but because the guy doesn't have the money to pay for it, the pharmacist says, no, you can't have it. What should the guy do? Steal the medicine because for utilitarian reasons? Well, it's left open-ended. And just as important as what they choose, I mean, almost everybody says, yeah, of course the guy should steal the medicine or something. But the reasons given by the various participants were very different, right?
Yes.
The men, in keeping with this picture of male morality as based on abstractions like Kant or appreciation for human rights or utilitarian calculations. Almost all of the versions we've considered so far in our past episodes, apart from Hume, who is seen as an early feminist, interestingly. All these involve these sort of abstractions. And so that's what a lot of the men in the study seem to look at. But according to at least some of the women here, and it's a slightly greater percentage of women than men, used language that was more in terms of the relationships involved, right? Mm-hmm. He should steal it because it was mean for that pharmacist to do that. And where does that pharmacist get off? The guy loves his wife. He wouldn't be able to live with himself if he didn't help her. And even though he might go to jail, that's just a risk he's going to be willing to take. It seemed that some of the women in the study wanted to contextualize it more. This whole idea of asking these abstract moral quandaries are that they're abstract, and that a lot of the women in their moral reasoning out loud were filling in details. As Pat Churchland said in our last episode, again, being very influenced by Hume, that maybe just considering these rules in the abstract and how they apply to a given situation is not the right way to go. You need to consider the relationships and the situation in their concrete fullness. And there's no a priori rules that are going to tell you which way to go. It's going to be a judgment call based on your own feelings about the matter. And so if you don't have human feelings, you're not going to be able to do moral reasoning. It's not just a matter of reflecting on these abstract moral rules.
Well, a specific example given for the women was that the choice was made complicated by the question, well, if you steal it, then you might get caught and you might go to jail and then you won't be able to take care of her anyway. And that kind of answer was relatively common for the women. That's what Gilligan characterizes as relationship thinking, as opposed to the sort of calculation that was more typical of the males. And this was true regardless of whether they were young or older.
Right. So Amy is the little girl, and along with Jake, she gives her own explanation of the Heinz dilemma. And there's this whole idea that not only is she concerned with keeping the relationships, but she's also concerned with the story over time, which is part of the other context. So whereas Jake sees this as a math problem, but with people that is static and uncontext, she sees it as taking place over a long period of time. So she's concerned with, well, what are going to be the ramifications of this action in the sense of, will he be able to continue taking care of her? Really, she thinks that the best answer is for the husband to sit down with the pharmacist and just explain the situation again. And she really thinks that if the pharmacist comes to understand the genuine need that the wife has and the importance of the wife, then they can figure something out, like a payment plan, or maybe he can borrow the money from someone. And so she's trying to come up with all of these different solutions that rely on other relationships, that don't sever the relationship to the pharmacist, because she thinks that the relationship with the pharmacist is important going forward as well.
But nobody suggests that he poisoned the pharmacist's wife and then propose a group discount or something like that. None of that.
No, Mark.
Doesn't go that far into the relationship.
Nobody suggests that.
Now, notice that, you were the one who brought up the violent language.
Yes, right. That was another, in one of the first two chapters where they just show kids pictures that are ambiguous and rate how many times the men versus the women used violent imagery to describe them. And
make up stories. Make up stories for them.
Right. And the men were much more likely to put that in there.
One of the striking ones was, one of the pictures was of two sets of hands, one holding the other on a trapeze. So it was just a picture of the hands. And my recollection is that it was overwhelmingly the case that not all of them, but many more of the male respondents had a story associated with that picture that involved the violent death of the one being held up. And it might have been a mistake, or there might be some kind of interesting backstory, but nonetheless, someone dies. And for the women, the stories involved were about, saving people and holding on and stuff like that.
Well, and the women also put in safety nets.
That's
and
right.
There was even one story that was about two trapeze artists who were asked to do it without a safety net and refused because they decided that it wasn't worth the danger to their act to do so.
Yep.
So where the men are engaged in all of, I thought the story about, I think it was Nick who writes the short story about the picture of the two people sitting next to the river, and he imagines that there's a third person drowning in the river and that the two are the jealous lovers who are watching him die.
So much of that has to do with getting into issues of people's relationship toward humor and what do they consider humor, and does that reflect their anxieties? So it's not necessarily men like violence, and so they're more likely to tell these kind of stories, but maybe more men, if they have to amuse themselves by making up a story, are going to try to not do a romance. They're going to do something that makes them laugh. And one of the things that makes us laugh is, well, maybe more men than women, but anything that we're uncomfortable with, like getting hit by lightning or any violence involved. So to me, that experiment by itself did not convince me, other than just the obvious, yes, boys are more into playing that involves violence than girls. But don't we already know that?
Oh, but so you're making the point, Mark, that the fact that they were making stories self-consciously is an important aspect of it, and that the psychological analysis of that has to include the story-making part of it, and that it might not reflect their actual activity, say, in a given situation.
Sure. I mean, it's uncontroversial that men tend on average to be more violent than women. Just look at the percentage of violent criminals of the various sexes. I just don't want to mix these issues together. There's a lot of complexity here, I think. So I found the discussions of the Heinz dilemma and the interviews with women contemplating abortion much more revealing of something new and interesting here than this description of the people's reaction to the picture.
If I could just say one more thing about the pictures. I thought it was interesting that the women were more likely to depict violence in the picture that had one person isolated, whereas she pointed out that the men were more likely to depict violence in the situation where the people were touching. And there is something to be said for women are raised to have to not be alone, and that if there's any sort of dangerous situation, you have to be escorted. So I remember, for example, a time that I had a friend who was talking about how they wanted to escort her back to her car at the end of her work shift. And she said, I'm 6 foot and I'm strong and I'm a martial artist. I just didn't understand. And then a little bit later, she said, and when I was a boy, nobody ever offered to walk me back to my car. Meaning that I think that there is this idea that we try to protect women from violent situations. We try to make sure that women are separated from violent situations. And we also tell women over and over that you shouldn't be alone because situations in which you're alone are likely to be potentially dangerous.
And so this is the culture of safe walk, not the culture of what Freud is pointing at. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So Freud's got this picture, male independence, right? They start with the Oedipus complex, and attaining maturity is achieving separation, is breaking away from the mother. Whereas for women, there are different things that happen, and it's not necessary for them to break away from this key relationship. One of the chapters in here is called Visions of Maturity. And if your standard of maturity is having this separation, then women are not going to measure up in the same way because that's just not the way they're raised. So Gilligan, though she doesn't like the characterization of the female as deficient by Freud and these other folks, admits that there's a difference. That's the whole point of the different voice.
Whether there is a human nature, then you would want to ask, well, are there differences of human nature? Does difference develop into genuinely different beings? So if you have genuine difference, then are they different things? And if they are, then how are they related? The question of difference goes back to the question of relation. That if you have things that are relatable, then how different are they? And if they are genuinely different, then how are they relatable?
I want to go back to this Heinz example. The thing that struck me about this was her discussion about how the boy, Jake has a calculus, right? Where he says essentially, screw the pharmacist, because whatever the amount of money is that he's going to lose, it's not equivalent to a human life. And I think a judge would agree with me, right? Isn't that one of his lines, that he feels like if he went to court, he would have a justification for his action? And the girl, Amy, right, she's interested in the context. And what's interesting about what Gilligan points out about this is that the situation as it's constructed by the interrogator, right, because Gilligan's also concerned to talk about the way that the person who's asking the question asks the questions and how he pursues it. But the simplified sort of moral dilemma is always sufficient for the boy, but the girl always wants more context. She always wants to understand more. What are the specifics of the situation, and what about the relationship between, and what about the future state, and what about this, and what about that? Gilligan's concerned to make a point about the way in which males and females essentially approach moral dilemmas. And I wanted to tie that back to the Gilman in the sense that Gilman's society, this utopian society, her view of it, even though you might be able to look at it and say, oh, well, this is really a socialist utopia, etc., it's still constructed in such a way that there's this rational analysis of the full context of the situation with regard for the future and the possibilities and the relationships between all the people and the decisions that they make about how they're going to move the society forward or how they're going to structure the society are based on considerations that still align very closely with what Gilligan describes as this female gender-specific approach to moral problems and not so much the male approach. So I did see a level of consistency there between the two, even though you might read the Gilman to be talking about socialism, and then you get off on the topic of rationality and reason, which is a whole nother issue. There still was that bit that I thought they sort of connected on.
That sounds right.
That is absolutely on target in terms of what Gilman was doing.
What do we want to say about the abortion interviews?
I don't want to talk about those. It's going to take us too far.
Well, we should say what the replacement that Gilligan gave for Kohlberg's theory of moral development, right? Which is this progression to an appreciation for abstract justice or something like that. That the female version of this was starting out like the men in this selfish survival mode. But then instead of the second phase being trying to conform with whatever the society's rules are, it turns straight to altruism. And this maybe turns on women's exploitation, that the way that women interpret going along with the crowd is not obeying some code like men might, but be giving of yourself because that's what society is expecting of women. Just squash what you want and do what I'm asking of you. And then for the mature final stage for Gilligan, it's a matter of realizing that I'm a person too, and my needs need to be taken into account too, and sort of finding yourself, reasserting yourself, not becoming selfish again or something, but rather getting rid of the whole selfish, selfless dichotomy and seeing that caring for others is legitimate and caring for yourself is legitimate, and that it becomes a balancing act between these two things. And again, there's no easy formula to apply that's going to resolve individual situations. It becomes this inelimitably complex, and I'm putting this in a way, again, that sounds very much like the way Churchland was talking in our last episode. When you're thinking of particular situations and you just have to take into account all the individuals involved and their individual needs and the circumstances and do some hard thinking. And that seemed to be what in the abortion interviews, what the kind of maturity as people were progressing, she was seeing more of. That the less mature people weren't taking responsibility for the choice being theirs at all, or for being in the relationship or being in the situation where they would be getting pregnant or any of that stuff. And as they attained more of a sense of self and thought that they didn't just have to do what other people told them to do, then this was the positive step. This was the trajectory that she was able to glean from these interviews.
Because I read this the second time on a Kindle and they don't have freaking regular page numbers in it, I can't tell you where in chapter 3 it is, but there's this long paragraph where it seems to me she summarizes a lot of the lesson learned from these interviews. She says, the moral imperative that emerges repeatedly in interviews with women is an injunction to care, a responsibility to discern and alleviate the, quote, real and recognizable trouble, unquote, of this world. For men, the moral imperative appears rather as an injunction to respect the rights of others, and thus to protect from interference the rights to life and self-fulfillment. Women's insistence on care is at first self-critical rather than self-protective, while men initially conceive obligation to others negatively in terms of non-interference. Development for both sexes would therefore seem to entail an integration of rights and responsibilities through the discovery of the complementarity of these disparate views. For women, the integration of rights and responsibilities takes place through an understanding of the psychological logic of relationships. This understanding tempers the self-destructive potential of a self-critical morality by asserting the need of all persons for care. For men, recognition through experience of the need for more active responsibility and taking care corrects the potential indifference of a morality of non-interference and turns attention from the logic to the consequences of choice. In the development of a post-conventional ethical understanding, women come to see the violence inherent in inequality, while men come to see the limitations of a conception of justice blinded by the differences in human life.
Blinded to
Thank
the
you,
differences.
Mark, for correcting my prepositions.
It makes a difference, actually.
It makes a huge difference. A kind of hyper-rationalistic view of morality tends towards a kind of hyper-universalism, where you then make everybody the same. There are no contingencies, there's no context, there's no special circumstance. And that's sort of the extreme case of all human beings are one kind of being. And then on the other end, you would have a kind of radical contextualism in which every human being is utterly different from every individual human being, that there is nothing genuinely relatable about them. And those would sort of be the polar opposite. Each individual human is a instance of a being that is not relatable, that's utterly different. And then you have, of course, a big span in between. Gilligan seems to put women in a concern for care that has to do with preserving relationships by changing the rules, and men with giving up relationships but preserving the rules. Just those two differences lead to a different, whether they're male or female or not, I think is probably, it's not beside the point for Gilligan, but they certainly represent two different ways of understanding morality.
Yeah, that's the way I ended up reading this, as being something about a commentary of different approaches to ethics, as opposed to when I was reading some of the online commentary about Gilligan. I mean, Gilligan says here, look, this is not a representative sample. It's not been clearly scientifically established that there really is this much greater adherence to care language in women than men. It seems like both kinds, the abstract morality language and the care language, occur in both sexes. Clearly, they're both things that are percolating around our culture. And I guess to me, it doesn't matter, because ultimately these insights that are supposed to appear when we strip away the looking purely at men or purely at white men in a particular culture become to the benefit of us all. And there's some generalizations you can make about this is the way men are and this is the way women are. But like you were saying in your quote from her new introduction to this book, Dylan, that's not really her point, right? That in a different voice is not just the monolithic female voice being different than the monolithic male voice, but really opening things up to some sort of pluralism.
I think that's right, but I think that it would be disingenuous to say that she isn't in the work focused on studying women for a reason.
Yes.
It isn't a case where she's immediately leaping to some kind of transgender understanding.
Well, but that's the way the end of that quote that you just read is that, look, once we realize this, then we realize how men who have only achieved the ideal of a Kantian rationalist view on morality are actually themselves not fully morally mature. They need to incorporate this other part as well. And likewise, women, maybe there's a different trajectory, but ultimately all this stuff is to the human good. These both ways of thinking about morality are, you sort of need them both for a complete, comprehensive, mature view.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay, so one of the critiques of Gilligan that comes up a lot is whether she's trying to make this as a claim that is essentialist. And I don't think she's trying to make this as a claim that's essentialist at all. I think she's talking about women in an American context. And one of the things that I would point out is that in general, women are engaged in care work more often than men are. So if we think about caring as a practice, then it would make sense that if women are engaged in this practice more often, that it's going to change the way that they then view the world. You know, in the same way that a physician is going to look at you differently than an engineer, a caretaker is going to look at you differently than a capitalist, for example. So men, by not being allowed access to this care work, are being denied a certain type of moral thinking as well.
This is such a massive topic. It's really difficult and unfair to try to approach it. First off, I would say to the listeners, the Wikipedia entry on feminist philosophy is not even worth reading. It's what they would define as a stub if they bothered to do the work to actually look at it. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a slightly better entry.
Well, they have several entries. They have one on just feminist ethics
and
they
feminist
have moral psychology, and I found that pretty valuable.
They have multiple entries about specific areas, but if you just do the feminist philosophy one, it was written by somebody at Penn State, I think. It does a pretty good job of kind of laying out some high-level stuff. But one of the things that when Mark and I were talking about this, Jesus, what was it, a year and a half ago? I mean, it's been forever we've been trying to do this episode, is that so much of what we understand as, let's call it feminist philosophy, requires an understanding and a knowledge of specific philosophers or the tradition or themes in philosophy that we felt like we couldn't read a lot of this stuff. For example, Luce Irigaray, right? You can't read her without reading Nietzsche. You can't read Kristeva without knowing something about
Derrida, Lacan. I don't know.
It goes on and on, right? It's like it was too complicated a topic to kind of approach for our subject matter. And that's why we turned to Azura, was to try to get some help. And what you see is we didn't even pick a philosophical readings. Gilligan's work is an exercise in scholarship. It's a standard text, but it wasn't just like a movement of the period. I mean, this was a meaningful and significant book in academia and in scholarship. I think it holds up quite well. And yet you see this discussion. There's so many different threads. There's so many issues that open up. It's very hard to stay focused. It's been hard for me to stay focused. I wish there was an easier entry point.
My impression is that the easier entry points are all crap. Like if you were to read, and I don't have any names in mind here, but I mean, just the kind of discussions that people tend to just get into, are men really different than women? How unproductive are those discussions usually? There's so many individual insights you can stumble on, but they don't turn into anything systematic and philosophical. And I liked both of these readings, especially the Gilligan, as a way of saying something concrete and real and measurable about an observed difference in particular interviews. And what are we to make of that? And how this constitutes a challenge to a lot of specific scholars in this specific area. And then once you've got that in, then you can sort of see how you might make similar critiques. We'd have to read something else. What is a feminist epistemology? What is a feminist metaphysics? All this talk of substances, that's so manly, and women wouldn't come up with the concept of substance. They would be more process oriented. I don't know. It goes in a lot of different directions.
You're absolutely right.
This at least stayed very sane.
I agree. I mean,
and
just to mark on that point, like if you buy what Gilligan says, and it's hard not to, and you look at Herland and you think of it as kind of like a literary articulation of some of these themes, you can call into question the whole social contract enterprise. Or you can go back and you can say, oh, guess what? Rousseau was feminine and Locke and Hobbes were masculine or something. There's a lot of different ways to go with this that are really, really interesting. I don't know, man. I want to know more. I want to talk about it more, but it's tough.
It is tough. I mean, and I think that there's something to be said for, too, in terms of myself and the things that I was trying to say. I'm obviously reacting against a lot of positions and a lot of different movements. So on one hand, I'm trying to just have a conversation about feminism. But on the other hand, you sort of have to tread lightly for all of these minds that the listeners may not be aware are there. I don't want to fall into any sort of essentialist trap and say that I think that women inherently are more caring than men, or that women inherently are more likely to think about things in a certain way. But I do think that the way that men and women experience the world is different. And having these different experiences leads us to naturally think about things a little bit differently. For me, the goal is for us to come up with a way to basically be able to have all of the different types of human experiences that we want and not be limited by our gender in having those experiences. And I think that Gilligan does a really good job of saying, look, if you have had the kinds of experiences that women have in this society, in this current time, then these experiences lead you to look at the world differently. I thought the example of the story where the physician finds out that she's at the top of her class, and where the women looked at this as something that was a little bit more negative or potentially chancy, whereas the guys all thought, well, she's at the top of her class, that's great. Now, one way to look at that is to say, well, women don't want to be in competition. Another way to look at that is to say, maybe there is something in our society which actively discourages women from winning competitions. You know, if you've had enough experiences of coming in number one and then being isolated socially later, or whatever the negative might be, then you may decide, you know, I'd rather lie low and not have that sort of exposure. And it may not be for the reasons that Gilligan is talking about. It may be for reasons that have more to do with how women experience success, which is something that she also discusses as well.
See, maybe the male reaction to this presentation is that now we have to solve the abstract conflict between nature and nurture. That we need to figure out whether these differences that Gilligan observed are essential due to some biological matter, or whether it's a matter of socialization, like you said. And if we had a society where men were not oppressing women, then we would not see these differences. Whereas I feel like Gilligan has already told us that she doesn't want things to snap back into looking at this new information through these old paradigms, or rather, like the women in encountering the moral situations, we don't want to just break it down to some abstract categories like nature and nurture and try to figure those out in the abstract. We just need to consider the concrete situation of women as it is in this society or whatever society the writer happens to be in, and how do we deal with that? It only matters what is nature versus what is nurture insofar as we're trying to come up with remedies for this. So, let's try to fix the social conditions and then we'll see what's left, or we'll learn about these things sort of in the course of our dealing with the concrete complexity of the situation, not by backing off and having some sort of abstract philosophical argument about abstract terms.
The only reason I brought up the nature and nurture was just because I think that a lot of times when women say, I want things to be different, they hear this rejoinder of, but women are essentially X. And I think if you look at the historical record, when women have been told women are essentially X, that's eventually been shattered. We're now seeing that the record holders for, the Olympic 100-meter dash and things like that the difference between the men and the women is getting smaller and smaller as we're now figuring out how to train women more properly. So if you say to a woman, well, you just can't run because women are not going to be runners, then of course she's not going to try. That's the only reason that I want to bring it up, is to just say that personally, I fall on nurture more so because I think that that's something that we can change. But then when people fall into the essentialist nature trap, then they just say, well, this is just the way the women are. They're irrational. They're unreliable. For whatever reason, they're just not going to be able to compete.
Well, Azura, I'm sorry to tell you, though, you're just not going to win the biggest penis competition, however hard you try.
Well, okay. Well, Gilligan has a great comment about this issue of gender differences and biologically versus socially constructed that I guess I'm obsessed with quoting tonight, but I want to read this one as well. She says, I find the question of whether gender differences are biologically determined or socially constructed to be deeply disturbing. This way of posing the question implies that people, women and men alike, are either genetically determined or a product of socialization, that there is no voice, and without voice there is no possibility for resistance, for creativity, or for a change whose wellsprings are psychological. At its most troubling, the present reduction of psychology either to sociology or biology or some combination of the two prepares the way for the kind of control that alarmed Hannah Arendt and George Orwell, the hand over the mouth and at the throat, the suffocation of voice and the deadening of language which ripen the conditions for fascism and totalitarian rule, the psychic numbing which is associated with that now curiously unspoken word propaganda. The thing I like about that is,
besides that she's a great writer,
it's
very, very mellifluous.
Yes. What I like about that is it accentuates another of the words in the title of the book, which is voice, which is the notion of each person being an individual actor that has an activity of their own, and I guess implied with that a moral status to it. And in her case, it implies a self-motion that is not wholly determined by either nature or nurture, or even just a combination of those two things. That from her perspective, you're missing a huge part of the boat if you forget the fact that individual people are active entities, that they aren't determined by some combination of nature versus nurture. That I find very interesting and very satisfying, and in concert with the rest of her book. I like that very much.
That sounds like a closing. Who else has a closing? Not willing to close down, other than there's too many issues here. Is that your closing?
That's my closing.
I feel bad, Seth, that you feel so despondent about the
No.
discussing the topic.
Despondent is not the right word.
Well, I don't mean despondent in the sense that you don't like it. I mean despondent in the sense of at a loss for approaching it in any measure successfully.
No, I don't think that's the case. I guess what I would say is maybe this is one of those things where we picked a very broad scope, and given our format, it's very difficult to treat it appropriately. Maybe it requires some additional discussion or a different way of segmenting. Unfortunately, as is evidenced by both the Wikipedia entry and Mark's point about the Stanford Encyclopedia, maybe we should have done a podcast on feminist moral philosophy or psychology or feminist epistemology or something along those lines and narrowed the scope a little bit. But if we had done that, we would have missed out on the opportunity of reading both of these great books, which I highly recommend to the listeners.
Well,
That sounds like a call for a second podcast.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I would also change the rule, right? I would say that it's not necessarily have to be constrained by the idea that this was a podcast about feminism, but just like all the other podcasts, you read a book, right? And you talk about that. These were a good pair, I thought.
I thought they were an excellent pair.
Yes.
I agree with that. What I felt constrained about was like using these two texts as a lever to talk about feminist philosophy, and I got caught up in the concept of what was feminist philosophy. But I thoroughly enjoyed Herland for both the style, the wit, the social commentary and criticism, as well as the ideas. And Gilligan, this took me back to when I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and optimistic about the future and participating in a humanities program. This is just to share an anecdote. The first year of college I went to, I graduated from Reed, but the first year of school I did was at a place called Occidental, which is in Los Angeles. And it was funded by, I think, the Occidental Petroleum Corporation or something like that. But it's another small liberal arts school. It just happens to be near Eagle Rock in Los Angeles. And I was part of some sort of honors program or something like that there. And the year I did was this whole year of broad-based humanities. We did things like part of the curriculum was we had to write fiction or do a piece of art, and we had to do like volunteer work at a clinic. There's a whole bunch of stuff involved, but this was one of the texts I read as part of this program, and it had a pretty profound impact on me. You know, I was 19, first year of school, encountering all of these new ideas, and this was really, really, really a significant work in my life. And so I embraced the opportunity to sort of revisit it 20 years later, or 24 years later. Jesus Christ, 24 years. This is getting very personal, so I'll just let it go. But this wasn't just like another reading for me. It was like nostalgia combined with significant academic work, combined with very heavy and interesting and important ideas.
It sounds like you and Dylan were much more sensitive to college bills than I was.
Seth, I think I understand where you're coming from in a lot of the things that you said, especially about the entry point. Because, I mean, I was really scratching my head trying to come up with a good initial book and that would allow us to discuss these themes in the way that they're meant to be discussed. And I think that this conversation was really great and I really enjoyed it. And I'm really glad that I got to read these books. But there is something to be said for feeling, you know, I had this really great meal and yet I'm still having a craving for cheesecake, even though I had pecan pie. That may or may not be how you were feeling.
Are you saying you have an eating disorder? Is that what you're saying? Listeners, if you thought this was great and it makes you hungry for pecan pie, then you should go to our blog, partiallyexaminedlife.com, and demand another feminism episode, and maybe in a year and a half we'll get around to it. Thanks, Azura, for gracing us with your presence and for recommending these readings. Just great to have you on and hear your thoughts on this.